Let's go. Good morning, Mr. Mukelenga.
Good morning, Ron.
I'm glad to see you back here with us. Congratulations on making it this far.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're excited to know more about you, and I have a couple of questions. These are mostly technical questions, just to see if you're the perfect fit for us, and to see if we are the perfect fit for you. Is that okay with you?
Oh, yeah, that's okay with me.
All right. So without any further ado, I would like us to jump right in. So my first question would be, when does the worst case of quicksort occur to you?
Okay, so the worst case in the quicksort would occur. Firstly, we will have to understand how does it even work. So the quicksort actually works by dividing the array. For example, we want to sort an array, and we first actually divide an array into two parts. So it means that it uses something kind of log of n, O of log n, and it means that the worst case is that when we are trying to divide the array, we're actually getting difficulties of finding all of the time. Each time we divide the array into two parts, we find something to solve. Every time we want to divide the array, we find something to solve. It means that we will have to sort even the last element of the array at the end. So reaching the end of the array means that it is the worst case scenario. Whereas the best case scenario is when we actually find most of the elements already sorted.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. My next question would be, what is a stack, and where can it be used?
Okay, so a stack actually is first a data structure, and actually, how is it used? It's the kind of data structure which has to deal with elements that comes first and an element that needs to actually be retrieved first. It means that using a stack, we can have a collection of data, a collection of maybe let's take books, and then we first come to add a book to the stack. The book that we've added the last actually is the one that is going to be retrieved the first. It means that we are now going to start by the one which came at the end, or the very first time, the first book we've added. So the use case for this one actually, it can be very useful in undo and redo stuff. For example, while working with some kind of editors, maybe Figma, for example, you have made a mistake, then you want to reverse the changes back to the previous states. Using stuff, this one can be helpful. So this is one of the use cases for this stuff.
Oh, thank you for the answer. My next would be, this is going to be an HTML and CSS question, and I would like to know what you think a CSS selector specificity is, and how does it work? So what is a CSS selector specificity, if I can pronounce that correctly, and how does it work? Yeah.
Okay, so the CSS selectors actually help us get access to HTML elements, in which case, for example, we want to style HTML elements. So we want to actually get reference to each element. We want to access an H1 tag. For example, we have many H1 tags, and then we just are interested in the very first one, so, or the middle one. And using H1, like the selector for it, it's somehow going to be complicated since we have many selectors with the same name, elements with the same name. So using CSS selectors can help us customize, give custom names to specific elements in the HTML. So we can easily get access to them in the CSS while making some styling. So CSS selectors are just names we give to HTML elements in order to get access to them while making some styling.
Okay, so, and if you were to explain CSS selector specificity to me, how would you go about that? So you've explained CSS selector, and I appreciate that. What about specificity?
Specificity,
yeah,
of CSS selectors.
Yes.
Okay, so I can say about that, and what I can say about that is specificity. Specificity is getting actually access, just gives us access to elements, so we can manipulate them.
Oh, okay, all right. Thank you. So my next question is also in CSS and HTML, and I would like to ask, have you ever used the grid system? And if you have ever used the grid system, which system do you prefer?
Okay, yeah, I've used the grid system,
right?
And the question is what grid system I do prefer?
Yes. If you've ever used the grid system, what grid system do you prefer? Yeah.
Okay, so the grid system I prefer is actually the grid itself. So actually CSS Flexbox can also do quite the same job, but what I prefer is the grid system, since with the grid system, actually we can achieve any kind of layouts we need using the CSS. So using the grid actually makes my life even easier while working while trying to style and layout elements on the page.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So my next questions would be in JavaScript, because I read your resume, and I got to realize that you're familiar with JavaScript, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
And my question to you concerning JavaScript is, can you give me an example? I would like to see an example of a query function, familiar with query functions, and why this syntax offers an advantage.
So which function?
Query function. A query function, if you're familiar with
query function.
Yeah,
query function.
Yes.
Okay, so should I open a Visual Studio?
Please go ahead.
All right, so can you allow me to share? All right, one minute. So actually, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file. So let me try to open a random folder. Let's open system. Let's go to freeze. Okay, so let me pick up a folder from the document. Let me fix the TypeScript. Okay, so let me create an index.js file. So talking about caring functions, these are actually kind of functions that we call, and they also tend to call multiple functions at the same time.
Okay.
So you may have, for example, a function which is called trying to file capitalize, something like this. So it first takes a string, str, for example. Then it takes another argument, maybe something it wants to add. So whatever item it wants to add, maybe something like that. And then at the end, we may also want to do what? To capitalize now the string. So we can call another function and give it our str, and at the end we'll have like this C, for example. So carrying is actually this this technique of calling multiple functions where the output or the return of the first function is actually the input for the next function.
All right.
So with this, actually, we can also parameterize the carrying functions by adding just an extra argument at the beginning. For example, an arg. With this one can be just a normal argument that we can pass. And at the right side, we have other consecutive functions that call each other after you have performed some actions. So this is how carry function works. It means that it's a series of function calls where the first function returns something. Maybe having these functions in this way, like the one that takes the string, maybe input is a function, then it has a string in here, is 0. And then it returns another function. For example, here, let me put just the capitalize here. So it takes the capitalize and gives it as a parameter the str, for example. The str is received. And then in here also we may have another function called where the result of the capitalized function constitute the inputs for the next function. So we can have another function and then call it. So using carrying, we can combine all of this together using these arrow functions like this. So we call each function on the same line.
Okay. So thank you for that example. So why do you think this offers an advantage in JavaScript? Why don't I just create different functions to handle all those separate, the separate arguments? Why is there a need to chain all of this together?
So the need to chain all of this together is actually what I think about that is that we can, as you can see, we can gain a bit of space. Okay. You can gain space by calling all of the functions together in this way. And it also reduces the complexity of what we are trying to do.
Oh, so you mean you can clean up code using this kind of syntax?
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that example, and thank you for your explanation.
Thanks.
Also, my next question is also still in JavaScript. So,
Okay.
what I want to know right now is what do you think is a significance reason for or the reason for wrapping an entire JavaScript content, source file into a function block? Because I'm sure you've seen it. You've seen an entire source file wrapped into one function, or one source file of a JavaScript, one JavaScript source file wrapped into an entire function. So what do you think is the reason for that? What's the significance for that?
So, okay, the use case for that, why do we need to wrap an entire JavaScript code in a function call? Is that we actually want to have the execution of that function that does not really somehow ends. It means that when you call the function, you're not creating a server somewhere, like using Node.js. You can create a server, then the server will still keep running. Means you can perform all of the actions you actually want to perform. But while working with plain JavaScript, and for example, I did it with the browser. So wrapping the JavaScript code in one function, and then when we call that function, what happens is that the code inside the function will continuously will be run all the time. It means that we can still be performing actions or calling functions inside that function without having to worry if certain elements or certain functions will not be reached. A typical example of this is when dealing with plain JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, and a DOM. You want to manipulate the DOM. It may happen sometimes that a function got called only once.
Okay.
It's got called once, and then when you updated something in the DOM, you did not get any feedback from that function. It means the code could not reach that function anymore. So having to wrap the entire code in a function call will prevent this behavior.
Oh, okay. I'm just curious about this question as well. Are you familiar with how scope works?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar with how scope works? Still concerning this question, are you familiar with how scope works?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
All right. So how do you think this wrapping of JavaScript functions, an entire source file into a function, affects scope of the entire window?
Okay, of the entire window?
Yeah.
So what I think about that, scoping all of that together means the function that will be, all the declaration we'll have inside the function will be proper or will be just for that same function. It means that all the variables we may have declared inside the function will only be available inside that same function. Okay. Something else outside is not going to access the content of that function. You can only have access to the function itself to call it. And then whatever inside the function is just going to be kept in there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So if you don't mind, I appreciate your answers to those questions, but I would like us now to switch to React because I saw that you're also familiar with React in your resume. Am I correct?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah, you're correct.
So I have a question for you concerning React. So in your own terms, in your own definition, what do you think props are?
Props. Okay, so in React, talking about props, it's a concept actually of, I'm not going to call it a concept because it's actually something. Okay. It's a kind of information. It's a kind of information that we want to share among components in React. Right. You may have an information from one component, and then you want to share that same information to another component, can be a child component. And how are you going to pass the information through to that component? Okay. That's when we use actually props. It means that properties, props can be shared between a parent component and a child component. Means that might be they have to be somehow linked together. I cannot talk to a different component. For example, using the app, and then the app has its own children. It can have the header as a child. And then we have a different component on the app, which can be maybe home. And then the home has also other children. It means the app cannot communicate with the home since they don't actually, they are not together. So the props are going to help us give information from the app to its children and from children to the app. But giving props from children to the parent component, actually it is different since it is not possible. Initially, it is not possible. Since the parent is the one that actually gives a function as a props to the child, then the child will call that function and gives it some parameters that the parent will also use. For example, it can be a search input, search. So what is happening? You may want to have your search and all the logic regarding search inside the search components, but actually the parent components want to get access to what you have found on change. So the parent will send you a function that you will be calling for you to get actually the actual result or the actual value we got from the input. So that's how props works, just sharing information between components.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Very good. So as well, my next question is still in React. And I would like to know what an event in React means to you. What is an event in React?
Okay, so an event. An event is actually a kind of action that occurs.
Okay.
For example, we may want to track something. We want to track something, for example, a BTN. We want actually to get access to certain information, or we want to perform some actions based on a behavior, based on something that just happened. That can be an example of hitting the login button. A user may have entered his credentials, like the username, the password, and then we want actually to perform some actions. We want to log in the user when he clicks on the button. So we can raise an event on that button. So an event is what? It's just an action that can be can occur. So it's an action that can be done, something that can happen. So we want to track that action.
Okay.
So those are events. So it's something that happens and we can track them. We can track it in order to perform actions. For that click event, so we call it a click event since a user is going to click. So that event is called actually the click event. So we can catch that event. How do we catch events? Is by raising. So we raise an event on a certain element. So we say when this button will actually have an event which will be called click, let's perform this action. Let's call this function. So that's how actually events are. They're just certain actions that occur when we interact with the page.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much as well for those answers. So I would also like us to move on to Ruby, because once again I saw that you're familiar with Ruby in your resume. And
yeah,
let me ask a question. Do you like using Ruby as a programming language?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I like Ruby.
So you enjoy it. So what are the advantages you found while using Ruby? What are some of these advantages?
So, okay. The advantages I found while learning Ruby, while using Ruby, I was actually comparing it with JavaScript since I started to learn JavaScript. Right. And now what I've realized is that Ruby has first a friendly syntax.
Ruby I'm sorry, could you say that again? Could you say that again? Ruby
okay.
has?
Okay, I said that Ruby has a friendly syntax. Okay. It means that writing Ruby code actually is somehow easier since you are like speaking. You as if you were just speaking with someone else. So it makes it easier to understand how it works, the flow actually, because it has many methods that just gives you an overview of what is just going to happen, since it's as if you will be talking to the language. So that kind of syntax makes it easier to understand how Ruby works. And something else I have appreciated using Ruby is actually the helper methods that Ruby has. Ruby has lots of helper methods, and as you can see, everything in Ruby is an object. So it makes it easier for you to actually manipulate different stuff. And with the use of, with the help of those multiple helper methods, it really makes your life much easier. You don't need to start implementing everything from scratch, actually. You want to get, for example, you want to perform some actions on string, and using JavaScript, it may happen that you start doing everything by yourself. But Ruby, most of the time, provides help of functions that can actually do the job for you just at one click, or you just write one line of code. So it's something I really appreciate using Ruby.
Thank you. It seems you do enjoy using Ruby. Okay, so my next question is also in Ruby. My next question is also in Ruby, and I would like to know what, according to you, what is the difference between a class and a module? Because I'm sure you've dealt with classes and modules. So what have you? What's the difference you've found between the two?
Okay, so the difference I found between the two is first the way we can actually call these things. So when we create, we cannot create a new instance of a module. We cannot create a new instance of a module, which is a difference, the first difference I can say. Since classes, before using a class, you create a new instance of that class, which creates a kind of object and gives you access to properties and methods from that class. But talking about modules, actually is a combination. So a module, like a class, first a class has properties and methods. That's what the class has. But what we can have using modules is that we can even have multiple classes in the module. So a module can encapsulate a very big functionality. So we can have many things work together in a module, because we can have even classes inside the module, which is different from a class. We're not going to have classes inside in other classes. We can only have properties inside classes and methods.
Okay.
And yeah, that's an example of a module. It's like enumerables in Ruby. We have the module enumerable, which gives us helper methods to deal with actually the array class. So you have all of the methods available for you to manipulate the array using the module actually.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your answer. I have a couple of more questions, and I'd like us to move on to Rails, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, it's okay.
So my next question is in Rails, and I'm sure you've dealt with routes while building Rails applications. So how do you think one should test routes while building a Rails application?
So how I think I should test routes?
Yes.
Okay, so the way I actually test routes is actually we can use a gem. We can use a gem for that. Okay. Like RSpec can help us handle the situation. But also most of the time, when it comes to actually testing the routes in Rails, I use the debugger.
Okay.
Like the pry. It's a debugger that helps you get all the requests. For example, you want to see if actually I got this path. For example, did the user actually was the user actually get redirected to the right path? So using that debugger actually helps me understand what is happening. What did I get from this route? What is the what was the parameters for the route? And also, I use just the console. I'm also using the Microverse routes. That gives me actually the list of available routes, so I can just dive into a route, go to the browser, trying to go to different routes. So when I find difficulties in that's when I actually use the pry to debug and see exactly what was the route that I sent, what was the path I sent, and that really helps me get always the result in the application of the running.
Oh, okay. So I have a question on this concerning the same question. So are you familiar with integration tests?
Yes, I'm familiar with integration tests.
Okay, very good. So how suitable do you think integration tests would be in this situation to test routes?
Okay, so integration tests can help us in these kind of situations because first, while dealing with routes, it may happen that, because let's just first try to understand how does the integration test work. So the integration test actually, it's when we are trying to test our application, but we actually going to touch some external dependencies. We're not going to be focusing on only the available features of the application. We need to test features, but also which deal with external dependencies. So with that, while dealing with routes, when we want to test routes, integration tests can help us in a situation where we are maybe talking to something else. Maybe our route is actually depending on some other dependencies. It means that we don't have everything by just ourselves. We don't implement everything by ourselves, but the route you're having in the application actually touches dependencies from outside. That's when we can actually even integrate with the integration test.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Hang in there, we just have a couple of more questions. My next question is also in the field of Rails. And I'm sure you've dealt with layouts and views in Rails, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so yes. I would like to know that when should you use content for? You know, the helper method content for? And when should you use yield? If you can show me the difference between the two.
Okay, so the content for, I don't quite use it a lot. Okay. And but let me try to explain according to my point of view what it can be. So actually using a content for may help us actually access some kind of information from outside the view.
Okay.
So, and the yield keyword. So the yield, how does it work? In Ruby, there is this concept of block. So while working with blocks, we may want, if we take an example of a method, we may actually want to give to a certain method a block of code as an argument, which is not really something possible. Like using JavaScript, you're not going to pass a block of code as a parameter to a function. So Ruby on Rails actually, even Ruby gives us the opportunity, the possibility to actually give or pass a block as an argument using the yield keyword. It means that we may have a wall functionality. Like, how does the yield even being used? Like, how is it even used in Ruby on Rails? If you look at the application RB, application.rb, it wraps its text. It gets the actual content, the full content of the application inside the yield. So what does that mean? It means that there are, in the internal implementation of Rails, there are some methods that will be looking at the routes. As the MVP, the model view controller. So you get the routes, it talks to the controller decides what view to render. And then when it decides what view to render, it renders it as a block. So that block will get called by the yield inside of the application RB. So using the yield is actually going to give us access to the actual view that is going to be displayed on the page. So the yield is just a container, something that gives us access to a block of code that is being passed as an argument to a certain method.
Oh, thank you. Interesting to call a yield a container. I love that analogy. Right. So, I guess I would like us to go through a coding challenge, if that's okay with you at this moment.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share with you a link. with the coding challenge.
Yeah.
All right, give me a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to send it in your chat.
All right.
Okay, so if you'd be kind enough to share your screen as you open that link.
Thank you. Let me open the now. Okay, it's trying to open.
Okay, let's give it a second. Okay, so I can see that it has finally loaded. All right. So
Okay.
if you can read the question and walk me through your solution.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to read the question. Okay, so it says that even the title is longest consecutive sequence.
Okay.
So given an unsorted array of integers, nums, return the length of the longest consecutive elements sequence. You must write an algorithm that runs in O of n time. So let's see the example. We are having nums, which is an array, 100, 4, 200, 1, 3, and 2. So we have the output of 4. What about the explanation? It says that the longest consecutive element sequence is 1, 2, 3, 4. Therefore, its length is 4. Okay, so if I try to understand, we are trying to get the consecutive elements that follow each other, directly.
Okay.
Like in here we have we have 1, we have 2, we have 3, we have 4. So when it comes to this one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. So what I try to understand here is this. We are having an array of numbers.
Yeah.
And for them to be consecutive, we have actually to only have +1. So for example, if we start by 1,
All right.
we can see that the only element that can follow is not going to be directly 3, it is going to be 2. So we'll be having something like 1 plus 1 or I plus 1. So if the I means the iteration in which we are, and taking the last element we have saved, if we add it to 1, then it gives the same thing. We can actually add it since it will be a consecutive element.
All right.
So it says that we're going to use the O of n, but I'm going to try to see what I can actually do with any time complexity.
All right.
And then at the end, I may think of a way to actually reduce the time complexity and use the O of n.
All right, go ahead.
So we're having the nums. I'm going to focus on this example here.
Okay.
So by which elements do we have to start actually? We'll be having the first element. So for me, what I think is the best way to do this is firstly identify the element that is the smallest. Having the element that is the smallest can help us now find the consecutive elements.
Okay.
So with this, using just this is probably going to be of, yeah, it can also be of n. Let me try it out. So we have none, say smallest, which will be equal to 0 initially. Then I can have a map each method. So for each item, you can even do this. So we'll be having a single item. So we're going to see if the item is actually.
So if I can chip in here, if you say that the smallest is equal to 0, but remember they gave us some constraints. If you can see down there in the question, and they said that the number can start from negative 10 to the power 9, all the way up to 10 to the power 9.
Okay, so having with this smallest value being equal to actually 0, it's not exactly directly something that you're going to take into account.
All right.
Since we'll have to set the very first item to this one. So when we have the first item, that is where we are going to start counting. So this is just a kind of default value that we are not going to be using. So this one means we can actually have it like none at position 0.
Right.
So considering the first item as the smallest one, we can compare it with other elements. So you can say item is the item greater or smaller. We're trying to find the smallest value. Is it smaller than the smallest? If it's that, we are going to change. So we're going to say smallest will be actually equal to this item. Otherwise, it should be equal to make it this. Okay. Otherwise, the smallest will just stay the same. So it will only be equal to smallest. So having this, we are going to see, I probably think that the use cases, we are having the exact same thing here. So by this, we expect to get 1 as the smallest element. So let's just try to see if what we have right here can work. So each element, if this current item is smaller than what we have here, we're going to reset the value of the smallest to that item. So otherwise, we are just going to set the smallest to the same value. So by returning smallest, I can actually try to find. So this is the way I want to go with challenges. I want to have some, I need to have actually the challenge, and I divide into separate smaller chunks somehow,
right,
which can be solved easily.
Okay.
So I'm having an error here. Let's just do this thing. So undefined local variable method now. Oh, right, this is nums.
Okay.
Let me run again. Okay, so we're having the smallest as 1. This is what actually we needed for now. So having the smallest value to 1, we can start by this smallest value and try to get a consecutive element. So I can create a new array here that I can call consecutive. So this is Rest elements, which will be initially set to an empty array. So I'll be having also now again the nums. And for each, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do this. Do and end. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to see. So this one, what I'm going to try here is I'm going to compare the smallest element with this item. So I can have a condition here. If item minus 1 equals to smallest. If this one is equal to the smallest, what are we going to do? So we are going to actually push it in our consecutive array. So we can have an end here, and then we can say consecutive element push item. So as you can see, this one is probably going to start from 2. Since we haven't yet inserted the smallest item.
Okay.
Which means after this line, what I have to do is say consecutive elements add smallest. So at this point, we will already have the 1 that we got here as the very first smallest element. So having this in place, we now have this other loop. This other loop with the condition that checks to see if the item minus 1 is equal to the smallest. Why do we need this? It's because the smallest of the previous item has to be the smaller value than what we expect to get. Means if the smallest value is 1, means item has to be 2. So if item is 2 and the smallest is 1, means 2 minus 1 will be equal to 1, and then we can push this element. After pushing these elements, we'll have to reset our smallest element. So I'm going to reset this one to item, since this will be now the last item we'll be having. So having to loop over this array multiple times like this, we will be changing the smallest value, or we can even call it previous value, while inserting each item that follows that element.
Okay.
So we're going to see what this will try to give us. If you run the code, so we're getting the wrong answer. This is the output. Wow, it doesn't seem to change anything. Okay, we did not return anything up to now. So what we're supposed to return is actually the length of consecutive elements. So I can return what length. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, now we're having 2, which which is not what we actually need. So we're going to try debugging the code and see what is actually happening. Since we're having two, there might probably be a place where we did not do the things right. So at this point, let me try to put the consecutive array and see what it has for now. When I run the code, okay, you can see that for the first case, 1 is the smallest, and that is what we have in the array. For the second case, we have 0, which is the smallest one. All right.
Okay.
So means at this point, we have everything right. So this is where we have to check. Let me bring back my condition. So if 1 is our smallest for this first case, let me try to put all of the items where which are just, I want to put 2. If this item matches this condition for the very first time without resetting the smallest value, this item must be 2, since 2 is the only element that comes right after 1. So let me run and see what that gives us. Yeah, we get in the 2, so
Okay.
that is what we're expecting to get. Yes, for this condition, resetting, this condition will give us 2, since 2 is the only element that comes right after 1.
Yeah.
So it means that the only thing we have to do right after that was to insert this element by even saying this array dot pushing this element. Now what I think can be the issue is maybe this one. So anyway, let's just keep it simple like this. We expect to get the array and actually a length which will be equal to 2, since we'll have inserted 2 items already.
Okay.
Okay, this is what we have, which means this is where we're having the problem. So the problem is where we are trying to reset. The smallest value. Right. So trying to understand what happens here is that if condition checks to this, only check this. Only when this condition will be true, that's when we will actually have this executed. But what is happening here is this. When we are at the very first item, and we see that this first item is not the element that comes right after 1, we jump. We pass to the next item. Right. And what is happening here is that we actually don't have something that will be repeated. We are only checking this array once. But as we can see here, we have 1 here. And when we are having the array, the mark or the each, it starts here, it says that 100 is not a 1, 4 is not a 1, 200 is not a 1, you get 1 is not also the 1, you get 3 is not a 1, and at the end we get 2. 2 is actually what you're looking for, but as you can see, it's the last element in the array, which means reaching this point, we will end up the loop. And when we end up the loop at this point, we'll only have 2 in the array, which means we might have a loop that actually is going to iterate again and again until it finds that the next element is not actually, the next element minus 1 is not actually equals to the smallest element.
All right.
So we can be changing this one, and that is when we may have probably some kind of while loop. So we'll be repeating this scenario while. So let me just write here while. No. So let me see. This is the condition that we think of. While this item is we can also do this. We can also actually sort the array. So if I run the sort method, by running the sort method, let me try to see if the array will be sorted. Again, the array is actually sorted. So having the array sorted can probably simplify the job for us. So by doing this, we can probably, okay, it actually seems to be the same thing.
How about if you uncomment line 14?
Ah, okay, I did not reset. So with this one, if they sorted array,
Right.
we can see that the result is this one.
Mm.
But this is giving the right answer. But I'm kind of not quite sure if this is the right algorithm for the challenge. When I think of the question, okay, apart from the time complexity, we can see that this is actually O of n. Since we are having O of n here, this is if I can have a comment in here after this line, this is O of n.
All right.
As well as our loop here. This is another O of n. So having something like this will end up having O of n. We end up having O of n plus n, something like this. And at the end, we will also still have O of n as a result. So the algorithm actually has O of n. We're not having O of n square in here. It's O of n, since we're having O of n plus O of n, which is going to give us the same O of n. Next, the time complexity is what we have been requested for. But what I'm thinking of right now, when I say that the algorithm doesn't really seem to be what we may need, if I understood very well the question, is that we are trying to find the longest consecutive element sequence. What does this mean?
All right.
This can probably mean that we may have consecutive elements which are also, for example, this is 100. If I can copy this array, if I can copy this array and paste it right here, I may also have maybe at the end here 101. So having 101, we will never reach this 101 since this 101 comes after 100. It comes after 100, but the last elements that we are checking for in our algorithm is this 4. So we're trying to see if we're having another 5. If we don't have another 5, if we don't have another 5, means we end up everything. We don't need to actually do anything else, which is not actually correct, since we may have other consecutive elements apart from the smallest element we're having here, we also have 102. So having 1, 2, 3, this is not 4, but what if we're having 103, 104, 105?
All right.
We can see that the longest consecutive element sequence is this one. We have a start from 100, 101, and 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the longest one. But with the algorithm we are actually having, we can't achieve this one. We can't achieve this. So what can we really do for us to achieve this solution? How can we improve this one, this solution to be efficient? So we started to find fortunately our array is sorted. Our array is sorted.
All right.
If we are actually having these elements here that follow each other, it means at a certain point we will end up having an element or having elements which are not going to be the right sequence, but which can also create their own sequence. That can come right after the if condition, since we don't actually care. We don't actually care with we may actually be having here. We may have another condition. If we have an else here, what can happen inside this else? While knowing that we have a sorted array, if we can take this sorted array, we'll be having this 1 up to 3. Let me take them. After 1 and 3, we have 100, then 101, 102, 103. What is this? Writing one back. Okay, 104, 105. So we can see that this sequence is supposed to be the longest one.
All right.
And this is, as you can see, this is a sorted array. It makes our lives easier because we will be, the first item will be 1, and the second will be 2, and then 3, and we'll be having 4. So what are we actually going to do here? When we reach this point, that is when this else will be executed.
Okay.
Because the array is sorted, we can try to see that in action. So we are expecting to get 100, and then probably 200. So if we put the item in here, we can actually get 100 and 200 since the array is sorted. What is this? This is not put. Yeah, we're having 100 and then 200.
All right.
It means that we actually have something that is good. So if we need now to actually see or keep the consecutive elements from the other side, we can try to do something like this. We can try doing something like this. If this item now means the item is actually not what we're expecting to get from this condition here. So the item is now probably going to create another sequence. So how are we going to know if it's actually another sequence we need to create? We can know that by also checking the next item from that item. So this item, what if I take as well the each with index, just for the same purposes, each with index, so we can have the index as well here. So if item, this can be a condition. If item plus 1.
How about if we don't use it with index, but somehow have a counter? You know, a counter that is going to keep track of the number of the longest sequence. So in case you reach you count up to 4, that counter will have the number 4, right? And then when you jump to the next, that is not the consecutive one, the counter goes back to 0. But in the end, when you get the longest counter, you can compare it with, so you store the 4 somewhere, right? So you count from 1 up to 4. So you store the 4 somewhere, and then you get you reset the counter to 1 or 0, depending on where you are, and then let that counter count the next sequence and compare the 2 sequences. And if the new sequence is longer than the old sequence, you replace the old sequence with the new sequence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really makes sense.
Yeah.
So if I do understand very well, we can have this sequence element is no longer going to actually keep track of storing those elements, since actually we don't need to see them, because at the end we only have to see the length. Okay. So this one, let's create that counter as you said. So this counter is going to be set to 0 at the beginning. So when we saw the array, we reach at this point, we're not going to push anything yet. We will let's just comment out this line for now. So if we reach this condition, we will be incrementing our counter. So counter plus equals 1. So whenever we have this condition, we actually increment the counter. We increment the counter. But when we jump out of this condition, means that we have reached the last element in this sequence, which means this condition will no longer be there, but it will be in the else probably. So having the else, in the else, we're not going to push the item, but we're going to push the actual value of the counter. The counter will be having, for example, 4 for the first item.
Thank you very much for that. Since now you're already on the right track, I would suggest we can move on to the next question. Thank you very much for what you've done here. Since you're already on the right track, it's now all well and good. Well done. Thank you so very much. Yeah. Thank you very much too. So I just have one more question for you.
Okay.
I just want you to freely think about this one and tell me how you would go about this. So how would you, in your opinion, how would you go about designing a YouTube clone?
Okay, a YouTube clone, like the full functionality of YouTube? Or,
yeah, but in simple terms, how would you go about designing the YouTube clone? Yeah, yes.
Okay, so how I would go for that? Firstly, I would try to understand exactly how does YouTube work. How does YouTube work? And once I have the clear understanding, when I actually understand exactly how YouTube works, I can now have a plan. What I can try first in text, what I can do is actually trying to design the database. The way the data is probably going to be stored, and how the user are going to, what are the different tables I'll be having in the application. So I'll be using a tool, creating ERD, so entity relationship diagram, which may help me understand exactly how is even the application going to work. I'm not going to actually care about the UI for now, since I don't know the functionality. How will I have the different types of data that I will be storing in the database? So having that in mind, I will first try to understand what are the available tables I really have to have. I really need for me to accomplish or to have this clone up and running.
All right.
After knowing what I need as the available tables in the database, I had to think, this is actually YouTube. It's not something where I'll be storing images. I'm not going to be storing items for 1 MB or 500 kilobytes. I'm going to be storing big data, big videos. So I also have to think about that. And it's something that is really going to be tricky, since I would also have first and first, I would also have to think of what's output is this going to be. Since I'm going to spend much money on designing the database, where am I going to store this database? Where am I going to get this amount of data? Am I going to be paying for this one? Where am I going to host this application? How can it cost? Knowing that in place, I can create some kind of rules or something like that for me to help, just to help me having an idea of what kind of information I will be keeping. If these are going to be videos, what is the limit, for example? I'm not going to design a full YouTube clone with unlimited number of unlimited capacity for videos. It can all really be costly. So if this is for learning purposes, I can fix the size of the videos that can be uploaded to the clone. After I know that, I will plan on where I can actually keep or deploy the application, when I can deploy my database, and what would be the pricing plan at the company or the platform where I'll be keeping the database of the application. When I have that, I will also think of the technologies I'll be using. So what are the actually technologies that can help me effectively have this application up and running efficiently? So I'll be seeing different technologies, and since I don't know many technologies out there, I can actually, according to me right now, if I can think of that, having many interactions on an application, it can become a little bit tricky using a Rails application. Since you have a need of JavaScript, you'll be needing to introduce JavaScript for you to have user interactions. So when I think about something like that, I realize that if I'm going to use Rails and then have to actually mix it with JavaScript in order to achieve a certain functionalities, I would now think of something else. I can think of React. What if I have a React like a front end and then a Rails API?
Okay.
So I can think of how I can design the full backend using Rails, and then use React as a front end. Since React is actually going to give me lots of customization, so I can actually deal with user interactions easily, since I'm not going to add any other external technologies for accomplish this task I'll be needing. So once I know about the technologies I'll be using, what can be next is now planning the job, by which actually features am I going to start? Am I going to start implementing the front end? Am I going to start implementing the backend? According to me, what I always appreciate is starting implementing the backend. So I want to understand that everything I have actually can even run from the command line, can run from the console. So I'll be creating the backend first. I'll be using something like Postman. Postman can help me handle requests. So it can be behaving like my front end. Then I can be fixing anything regarding the backend first, because I don't want to start the front end and then start dealing with dummy data. I want to create my own array, then start implementing everything from there. I may want to actually be dealing with the actual data I really need, the real backend that is already implemented. So having to design first the backend can be helpful. And since that is actually the most important thing, because that's where we need the security, the most actually, the big security, you can say. That's where we need to secure the application. So having to start implementing the backend will help me be even fresh. So I can be working on different features of the backend, while being not in a pressure somehow, something like that. And then I can start thinking of how I will be designing the front end. And of course, while talking about designing, having a plan is something that's really going to help me. I need to have deadlines. I need to understand what's the duration for this work. Am I going to take a week? Am I going to take a month? Am I going to take 3 months? So within these 3 months, what am I going to do each day or each week? What do I have to accomplish? So I'll be having something like that. I'll be having some kind of to do. So I'll be keeping track of the progress. This week, I need to work on this feature. This week, I need to work on this feature, and this week, and this feature. And with that, I can effectively have the application up and running and in time manner. So after that, I will also have to dive into the front end. With the front end, I will now try to, as it's a YouTube clone, I'm not going to be having difficulties since I'm not going to create everything from scratch. It's a clone, so I'll be having to follow the same design that I see on YouTube. So the only thing I may think of is what kind of libraries can actually help me achieve the exact same thing a bit quickly. So with that, I can think of CSS frameworks or CSS preprocessors like SAS that can make life a bit easier. And with that, I can start working using the mobile first approach. This is because I've been working on several projects, and what I've realized is that while starting working on the desktop version, it's sometimes not really looking as good as we may want on mobile versions.
Okay.
But starting with the mobile version, actually, you are somehow concentrated on making everything, you take it as a default one, since these days people start using mobile phones more than computers. So all the time people are using mobile phones. So if you can create a friendly UI for mobile devices, it is something that is really going to please your clients. So I will also choose to start using building or designing the mobile approach. I mean the mobile design. I'll be having the mobile design first, and then I will jump into the desktop version of the application. So I will also have to think of the security. And as you can see, YouTube has a lot of features. And it's something that has been achieved by several people. I'm not going to say that it is always going to be possible for me to have the exact same functionalities as what YouTube has. I will only be taking some features. I'll be actually picking some features I think are important and what I can actually be able to work on, since it's a work that has been done by several people, a community actually. I'm not going to say that I can design everything by myself. So having in mind that I can have this small or fewer functionalities or features I can add to the application will also help me actually go up to the end of the project. Because without knowing exactly what you really need for the application, when you want to design everything, you can actually having an application without the end. You're not going to know exactly when am I going to end. So I need to implement this and this and this and this and this. So having in mind what exactly I really want to implement is also going to help me. And at the end, after thinking about the security of the application, I will see how I can also deploy the front end, and now trying to see what can really be the outputs after having that clone. So is it going to be for learning purposes, or this is going to actually be helping me giving something back? So I would also try to think of that.
Okay.
What are the features I can introduce for me to be able to gain something? And for you to do something like that, you have to have features that excites your clients or your visitors. The visitor has to have to understand that, of course, this is a feature that I'm really proud of. So excited about this one. I may actually pay for this one. So having to think of something like that can also help you according apart from learning purposes. If it's all about learning purposes, so you don't actually need to worry about that. And at the end, I can just try to see if I can deploy the application. And yeah, that's how I plan working on such a plan.
Wow, thank you very much for that elaborate step-by-step process.
Thanks.
I appreciate that. Well, I would like to thank you very much for today's session. Thank you, Mr. Baraka Mukelenga. I'm glad we had this session, and we shall go over your answers and reach out to you if you have to find a decision. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I hope forward.
I'll talk to you soon.
I look forward.
Stay safe.
Thanks.